Chapter 1 of the Concept of Nature. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.B. The Concept of Nature. The Tarner Lectures, delivered in Trinity College, November 1919. By Alfred North Whitehead. Chapter 1 Nature and Thought. The subject matter of the Tarner Lectures is defined by the founder to be the philosophy of the sciences and the relations or want of relations between the different departments of knowledge. It is fitting at the first lecture of this new foundation to dwell for a few moments on the intentions of the donor as expressed in this definition. And I do so the more willingly as I shall thereby be enabled to introduce the topics to which the present course is to be devoted. We are justified, I think, in taking the second clause of the definition as in part explanatory of the earlier clause. What is the philosophy of the sciences? It is not a bad answer to say that it is the study of the relations between the different departments of knowledge. Then with admirable solicitude for the freedom of learning there is inserted in the definition after the word relations the phrase or want of relations. A disproof of relations between sciences would in itself constitute a philosophy of the sciences. But we could not dispense either with the earlier or the later clause. It is not every relation between sciences which enters into their philosophy. For example, biology and physics are connected by the use of the microscope. Still I may safely assert that a technical description of the uses of the microscope in biology is not part of the philosophy of the sciences. Again, you cannot abandon the later clause of the definition, namely that referring to the relations between the sciences, without abandoning the explicit reference to an ideal in the absence of which philosophy must languish from lack of intrinsic interest. That ideal is the attainment of some unifying concept which will set in assigned relationships within itself all that there is for knowledge, for feeling, and for emotion. That far-off ideal is the motive power of philosophic research, and claims allegiance even as you expel it. The philosophic pluralist is a strict logician. The Hegelian thrives on contradictions by the help of his absolute. The Mohammedan divine bows before the creative will of Allah, and the pragmatist will swallow anything so long as it works. The mention of these vast systems and of the age-long controversies from which they spring warns us to concentrate. Our task is the simpler one of the philosophy of the sciences. Now a science has already a certain unity for which is the very reason why that body of knowledge has been instinctively recognized as forming a science. The philosophy of science is the endeavour to express explicitly those unifying characteristics which pervade that complex of thoughts, and make it to be a science. The philosophy of the sciences, conceived as one subject, is the endeavour to exhibit all sciences as one science, or, in case of defeat, the disproof of such a possibility. Again, I will make a further simplification and confine attention to the natural sciences, that is, to the sciences whose subject matter is nature. By postulating a common subject matter for this group of sciences, a unifying philosophy of natural science has been thereby presupposed. What do we mean by nature? We have to discuss the philosophy of natural science. Natural science is the science of nature. But what is nature? Nature is that which we observe in perception through the senses. In this sense perception we are aware of something which is not thought and which is self-contained for thought. This property of being self-contained forethought lies at the base of natural science. It means that nature can be thought of as a closed system whose mutual relations do not require the expression of the fact that they are thought about. Thus, in a sense, nature is independent of thought. By this statement no metaphysical pronouncement is intended. What I mean is that we can think about nature without thinking about thought. I shall say then that we are thinking homogeneously about nature. Of course, it is possible to think of nature in conjunction with thought about the fact that nature is thought about. In such a case, I shall say that we are thinking heterogeneously about nature. In fact, during the last few minutes, we have been thinking heterogeneously about nature. Natural science is exclusively concerned with homogeneous thoughts about nature. But sense perception has in it an element which is not thought. It is a difficult psychological question whether sense perception involves thought. And if it does involve thought, what is the kind of thought which it necessarily involves? Note that it has been stated above that sense perception is an awareness of something which is not thought. Namely, nature is not thought. But this is a different question, namely that the fact of sense perception has a factor which is not thought. I call this factor sense awareness. Accordingly, the doctrine that natural science is exclusively concerned with homogeneous thoughts about nature does not immediately carry with it the conclusion that natural science is not concerned with sense awareness. However, I do assert this further statement, namely that though natural science is concerned with nature, which is the terminus of sense perception, it is not concerned with the sense awareness itself. I repeat the main line of this argument and expand it in certain directions. Thought about nature is different from the sense perception of nature. Hence the fact of sense perception has an ingredient or factor which is not thought. I call this ingredient sense awareness. It is indifferent to my argument whether sense perception has or has not thought as another ingredient. If sense perception does not involve thought, then sense awareness and sense perception are identical. But the something perceived is perceived as an entity which is the terminus of the sense awareness, something which for thought is beyond the fact of that sense awareness. Also, the something perceived certainly does not contain other sense awarenesses which are different from the sense awareness which is an ingredient in that perception. Accordingly, nature as disclosed in sense perception is self-contained against sense awareness, in addition to being self-contained as against thought. I will also express this self-containedness of nature by saying that nature is closed to mind. This closure of nature does not carry with it any metaphysical doctrine of the disjunction of nature and mind. It means that in sense perception nature is disclosed as a complex of entities whose mutual relations are expressible in thought without reference to mind. That is, without reference either to sense awareness or to thought. Furthermore, I do not wish to be understood as implying that sense awareness and thought are the only activities which are to be ascribed to the mind. Also, I am not denying that there are relations of natural entities to mind or minds other than being the termini of the sense awareness of minds. Accordingly, I will extend the meaning of the terms homogeneous thoughts and heterogeneous thoughts which have already been introduced. We are thinking homogeneously about nature when we are thinking about it without thinking about thought or about sense awareness. And we are thinking heterogeneously about nature when we are thinking about it in conjunction with thinking either about thought or about sense awareness or about both. I also take the homogeneity of thought about nature as excluding any reference to moral or aesthetic values whose apprehension is vivid in proportion to self-conscious activity. The values of nature are perhaps the key to the